Have you ever noticed that Paul's letter to the Philippians feels much calmer than some of his other letters? When you read Corinthians, Galatians, or the letters to Timothy and Titus, you can feel the urgency and even the tension. Those churches were facing serious problems that threatened their faith and unity. Paul had to speak very directly to correct them. But Philippians is different. The church in Philippi didn't have those same huge problems, so Paul could focus on encouraging them and reminding them of the joy they had in Christ. Even so, there is one part of this letter where Paul's tone becomes strong and forceful. It happens in this section we're studying. Here, he warns about people who were trying to force Christians to keep old Jewish laws, especially circumcision. Paul gives what you might call his Jewish resume. He lists all the reasons he could have trusted in his background and religious achievements. But then he says all of it was worthless compared to knowing Jesus. That's something worth thinking about. Are there things we're tempted to brag about or lean on instead of Jesus? Paul starts by saying, "Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord." That word finally doesn't mean he's about to end the letter. Paul sometimes used it simply to change topics or introduce a new section. In fact, he goes on for 2 more chapters. Why does he remind them again to rejoice? Because real joy isn't tied to circumstances. Paul was writing from prison. He wasn't free. He wasn't comfortable. But he was still joyful. Why? Because his joy was rooted in Christ. You and I can learn from that. Even if we are discouraged or going through hard times, we don't have to let grief or worry control our hearts. Do you sometimes find it hard to keep a thankful spirit? Paul shows us that true joy comes from remembering what God has done for us. Next, Paul gives a serious warning. He says, "Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision." Who are these people? They were Jews who had become Christians but were teaching that Gentile Christians still had to be circumcised and keep the old law. Calling them dogs was strong language. The Jews called Gentiles dogs, but Paul turned the term around. These men were like a pack of dogs, barking out false teachings, biting and harming the church, and poisoning people's faith. He also called them evil workers. They were zealous. They worked hard. But their work was harmful because it led people away from the truth. Finally, he called them the concision, which means mutilation. That was a sharp way of saying their practice of circumcision was just flesh-cutting. It had no spiritual value anymore. Why such strong warnings? Because false teaching is dangerous. If it isn't corrected, it can destroy souls. Do you see how Paul models courage in calling out error plainly? He wasn't trying to be mean, he was trying to protect the church. Paul says, "For we are the circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh." What does that mean? He's saying true followers of God are those who have their hearts changed, not just their bodies. Real circumcision now is spiritual. They are the ones who serve God in the way His Spirit teaches, boast in Jesus, not themselves, and trust in God's grace, not their own works. That's true for us today too. No matter your background, your culture, or your family tree, you are truly God's child if you are in Christ. To prove a point, Paul lists his credentials. He says, "If anyone could have confidence in the flesh, it was me." He was circumcised on the 8th day, just like the law commanded. From the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, fully Jewish by birth. A Pharisee, strict in following the law, so zealous he persecuted the church. Blameless in keeping the rules as far as humans could see. In other words, he was everything the Judaizers thought made a person important and righteous. But here's the twist. Paul says none of that mattered. Why? Because it couldn't save him. Here's what Paul realized. Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. When Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, everything changed. He saw that all his religious achievements couldn't make him right with God. Only Jesus could. So he gave up everything, status, reputation, career, even his old beliefs, to gain Christ. He actually called all those old gains rubbish, like trash to be thrown out. He said he wanted to be found in Christ, having the righteousness that comes through faith. Isn't that beautiful? Paul shows us it's worth losing everything to gain Jesus. Paul had one big desire, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. He wanted to experience the power of Jesus' resurrection, the hope and life it brings. He wanted to be willing to suffer for Jesus, just like Jesus suffered for him, and he was ready to die like Jesus if that's what faithfulness required. You know, he wasn't sure how long he would live, but he was sure of this. He wanted to be among the righteous when the resurrection happened. Isn't that the greatest goal anyone could have? Let's wrap this up by remembering a few important takeaways. First, rejoice because you are in Christ. That's where true joy lives. Second, don't be afraid to repeat the truth. We all need reminders to stay grounded. Third, recognize false teaching. Learn the Bible well enough to spot error. Fourth, understand that God's people are those in Christ, not those with special lineage. Fifth, count all earthly achievements as nothing compared to knowing Jesus. Sixth, be willing to lose everything if it means gaining Christ. Seventh, trust in God's righteousness, not your own goodness. Eighth, make it your goal to know Jesus deeply, even sharing in his sufferings. And ninth, long to be part of the resurrection of the righteous. Friend, isn't this a message we need today? In a world that pushes us to trust in ourselves, Paul calls us back to the only thing that matters, knowing Jesus and being found in him.